Hello, welcome to our webinar, What AI Means for Human Capital. I'm Elizabeth Heichler, Editorial Director at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator. This free webinar is made possible with support from our sponsor, Randstad. So, when generative AI exploded into public awareness late in 2022, it moved artificial intelligence to the top of organizational priority lists. Many corporations have become the setting for tech experimentation in the wild as employees play with new tools like ChatGPT to see how they might improve productivity. But many leaders remain deeply concerned about AI's consequences for work and the workforce. Our speaker today is a longtime MIT SMR contributor. Human capital expert Lynda Gratton from London Business School has been exploring the way forward in conversations with corporate leaders about their issues with and approaches to using AI. She will share findings from her current research with practitioners and engage with those of you here today with a number of polls intended to gain further insight into issues that are arising for your organizations. Welcome, Lynda.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And what a wonderful opportunity to talk about this incredibly important topic. And as you say, Elizabeth, we're going to be using both polls and the chat function. So please, this isn't a webinar where you can just sit back and relax. It's a webinar where you have to be absolutely determined to learn, as we are all doing. I wanted to start actually by saying something about where we've been. So, if you take a look at the way technology is changing, and particularly generative AI, you can see that from the mid-2000s on, there have been a whole slew of developments. But of course, the one that attracted your attention, and it certainly attracted my attention in the human capital field, was really what was happening in 2023 with the launch of programs like ChatGPT. And that's really what I've been watching since. I know that you've been watching it since. And what I'd like to do today is to talk about where I think we are, what the issues are, and also to learn something from you about how you're thinking about this right now. I guess, if we stand back for a moment and ask, what's the difference between predictive analytics, and we become familiar with that, and generative AI, and why is it making such a difference potentially to our working lives? I think, when I think about it, I think about, the millions of pounds that you've spent, for those of you in corporations, on IT programs where your CEO has agreed it. You've spent £12 million with an IT company, and it's been a hierarchical process, which many people have found frustrating. In some cases, the UK government, for example, you still haven't really got it working. And the real excitement about generative AI is it was on your phone. It was on everybody's phone. Anyone could use it. And suddenly we had the democratization of this sort of technology. And I want us to bear that in mind, because I think that's going to change the trajectory. Now, you perhaps know this model, David Utter's model. I teach my MBA class on the future of work. I'm teaching it next Monday, in fact. And this is where I start, because what it basically explains is the whole history of technology and work. And as you can see, two really interesting aspects, I think, about this model. The first is, don't think about the impact of technology on work at the level of the job. Think about it at the level of the task. And so if you think about your job or my job, I have to do about 30 tasks. You probably do about the same. Some of them are routine. They're tasks that you can easily get somebody else to do. Some of them are non-routine. Some of them are manual. Some of them are analytical. And basically everything in the routine area has already been automated. Now, whether in your country it's been automated depends quite a lot on the cost of labor. The higher the labor costs, South Korea, Japan, parts of Europe and so on, then the more companies invest in technology. But what we're interested really is the non-routine. This is the one that's much more difficult. And you see it in non-routine manual. I think by now we all expected to have driverless cars. I certainly did, but we haven't. But we're also seeing it in non-routine analytical. And I want to draw your attention to one other thing here, because you'll see on the left-hand side, it's got the question of substitution or augmentation. And one of the points I want us to think about today is that it would be a big mistake if we saw generative AI simply as a substitution technology. If we want, as humans, to get the most from this amazing technology, we have got to see it as an augmentation process. Now, you could be asking, quite rightly, well, Lynda, you're not a technologist, so why are you talking about generative AI? And I'm not an expert in generative AI. But what I am fascinated in is the world of work. I feel that what we're really facing now is an enormous technological push, but not necessarily a push that says, well, what does it mean for people? And that's really what I'm going to be exploring today. So before we start getting into that, let me ask you the first poll question. First poll question is this: which statement best describes your organization's current perspective on generative AI? A, is it a CEO priority where leadership is discussing the impact? B, it's not a CEO priority, but it's a top priority for your individual business units. C, it's on the agenda for business units, but not yet a top priority. D, it's not on the agenda in any meaningful way. So if you go to the poll, open it up and press A, B, C, or D. Now, I asked this question back in September, so I'm going to be very interested to see just what you think when you think about where is your organization's current perspective on generative AI, and where does it sit in terms of the CEO priority? Now, let's just see where we are on that poll. Now, this is the moment I have to put my specs on. Okay, I know I'm vain. Here we are. So the majority, and I don't even see it, I think it's 60, is that 50, 60, 57, 50% say it's really important to them. And you'll be interested to know, thank you for that, 42. My eyes are terrible. 42, so almost half of you are saying this is a CEO priority. People are really thinking about it right now. Our CEO is also really interested. So let's take a look at what we found last time we took a look at this. So we'll take, and this is September 2023. And as you can see, it's about the same amount. This is a bigger sample than the September. This September was my own research group. So that would be, I think we had a smaller number of companies involved. But again, you can see that it's very much part of this agenda for CEOs right now. So the bit that I'm interested in, and I think probably the bit that you're interested in, is what does it mean for skilled workers? Because when you go back to the David Uto framework, the reason why people are so excited about this is it's the first time really that non-routine analytical work can actually be done by a machine. And that's because of the large learning programs that are behind generative AI. And that's really opened up an enormous vista for how generative AI will affect skilled workers like you and me, and indeed many of the people employed in your organization and across the world. And I guess, what I wanted to talk about here was really a couple of points. The first is, this is very fast, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. But really, I'm monitoring it almost on a weekly basis. You're probably doing the same. It's moving extremely quickly in a relatively unpredictable way. And secondly, there are enormous claims made on productivity. Now, productivity is a very important issue for any government right now, because if you take a look at productivity measures for the US, for most of Europe, it's been relatively static. And one of the points we're making is, why aren't we getting any productivity gain, even though companies are investing in technology? And so there's a view that actually this is going to increase the productivity of skilled workers. Now, 40% of executives are saying, well, actually, that means we have to do a lot more reskilling. That's sort of pretty obvious. But there is a bigger story behind this. And that's really the story that I want to explore today. Now, to think about that, I've brought to you data from the McKinsey report on generative AI. And the question the McKinsey group were asking is, when is this going to impact? Now, this is a very interesting slide here, because what it shows you is what their panel of technologists thought a few years ago and what they think now. And the question they asked them was, when do you believe that this technology will impact these tasks that you can see on the left-hand side? Now, two things are really striking here. The first is, and this is a technology panel, by the way, but the first is that the technologists say, we think that this is going to impact on these human tasks much faster than we thought it would. So you can see that the whole scale is moving to a much nearer destiny in terms of when this is going to impact us. The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is even human tasks like creativity that we actually thought were the sort of last bastions. I wrote a book called The Shift. Here it is. And in fact, I've just written about 20 years ago, and I've just written a piece for MIT saying, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Because it was a prediction of about this period. How would the world change? And what did I get right or wrong? Well, what I didn't really anticipate, and I don't think any of us did, is just the speed with which this would happen. And what I talked about in The Shift is how important creativity is to the human endeavor. But here we have a bunch of technologists saying, actually, we think within a couple of years, it's going to be able to do many jobs and tasks that we believe to be creative tasks. And that, I think, is an area that we need to think about a great deal more and discuss a great deal more. Now, let me speak for a moment about the journey that we're going through. And for me, one of the reasons this is really interesting is that I went through this journey, I think we all did, during the pandemic, because when the pandemic happened on that particular day in March and we all closed our offices down, we were walking into a future and a destiny that we didn't understand. We simply didn't know what was going to happen. Now, of course, we have clearer technological parameters here, but nevertheless, I feel that we're walking into an unknown future. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm very pleased to be talking to you today, I'm so pleased that so many thousands of people from around the world are on this webinar today, is that this is a conversation we need to have. Just as we talked a great deal about the pandemic, should we work from home? Should we work in the office? What does it mean to work in the office? What does it mean to work from home? We embarked on a journey of discovery, and we're doing just the same now. This is a journey of discovery. And so what I'd like you to do now is to think about your own organization. And the question I'm going to ask you in a moment is, where is it on this journey of discovery? Are you primarily at the place of awareness, where you sort of realize something's happening, you're taking cognition of it, but it's not really moving yet further than that? Are you in a position of exploration where you're beginning to find out what others are doing? I'm working with a company right now in Europe where they're saying, yeah, I can see competitors are doing that. I'm reading about it, I'm hearing about it, I'm exploring, what we think we should be doing. Are you in a low stake experiment where you're saying, I don't quite know how this stuff's going to work. So what we're going to do now is to simply run experiments and see how they work. So, we'll find places around our business. We'll ask them to use the whole package of generative AI that we can use, and we'll see how it goes on. We'll just work that through it, but in a low stake way. We're not going to bet the whole business model on this. Or are you working on high stake experiments? And you'll see I've given you some examples here, where you're actually changing fundamentally the business model using generative AI as the mechanism to do that. Or finally, and Amazon is a good example of that, are you you've done your high stake experiments and you're now scaling, you're now moving it from experimental places, so it becomes part of the way that you do business in many of the parts of your business, not just in the ones that you've thought about as high stake experiments. So think about it this way. Is it awareness? Is it exploration? Is it low stake experiments? Is it high stake experiments? Or is it scaling? And I'm going to ask you now to go back into that poll. And this time you can see A to E. A, we're just aware. B, we're exploring. C, we're engaging in low stake experiments. D, we've got high stake experiments. And E, we're actually scaling right now. So tell me which of those you are currently doing. This, by the way, is very fascinating because I don't think we've collected this real-time data yet about how thousands of people from around the world are using generative AI. So I can't wait to see what you have come up with. Now, let me see where we are on that. So those are the statements, and yet I don't think we've quite got the poll data yet. Let me see if we have. I think it's still, there it is. Okay, so if you take a look first at awareness, that's 22%, exploration is 33%, low stake is 34%, high stake is 9%, and scaling is 4%. Okay, so we've got a very interesting normal distribution there. As a professor, obviously I love normal distributions, although slightly skewed towards the lower end. So if you were to do it as a distribution, it would look like this, wouldn't it? But basically, 20% of you saying it's sort of in our periphery. And this is going to be a great webinar for you because I think you'll learn a lot about what others are doing. It's 33 say it's something we're exploring with. We've got 33 are saying we've got low stake experiments. Only 9% of you have got high stake experiments, and only 4% of you are saying we're actually scaling it right now. So how fascinating is that? And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity maybe in a year's time to come back and ask that same question again. Where are you in terms of what's happening? So this is really a period, I suppose there's no surprise here, of exploration and low stake experiments. And that's why, doing what we're doing today, which is hearing a little bit more, talking to each other, understanding what we're doing, is so very important. So let's move on to the next slide. And to do that, I want to really just say something about what I see happening right now when I go and my consulting practice, HSM, talks to people from around the world. And I want to really establish where the functional control is going on here, because, one of the things I said at the beginning of this presentation was that the thing that really makes generative AI very exciting from a change management perspective, and that's the perspective I take, is that it's a democratic process. Anybody can pick up their phone and they can use it in their job. They don't even have to tell you that they are using it. I know this from my MBA students. I'm teaching a program next week about the future of life, of work. It should be the future of life. And I know that my students are all going to be using ChatGPT when they go ahead and write their essays that I will be marking. So, even if you tell people not to use it, it's very difficult to control that. So how are you thinking about not so much the control, but the learning mechanism? And I want to draw your attention to this new job title that's beginning to emerge, called something like Head of Generative AI. This is actually a case we wrote last week for Saatchi & Saatchi, the media company, where they have appointed a head of generative AI. It's a very important, prestigious job. The person who's in that job actually was head of strategy. So this is a very crucial a role that they're playing. And I asked him to describe to me what is it that you're actually doing in this job? What are the major roles you're playing? And I think these 4 are rather interesting. One is, of course, is to steer the strategic direction and alignment of AI work. Secondly, is to establish collaborative as an ecosystem. So what Saatchi are doing, and I know many of you are doing the same, is that they're actually getting different businesses to experiment. But of course, unless you have, links, collaborative links between them, you lose a lot of that lessons. So their role is to both establish, but then to build the connectivity, to really look at identifying high impact cases where parts of the business are doing things that they see are going to make a big difference, and then oversee the AI integration across the whole organization. So in a sense, if you think about how we described earlier, how organizations are moving along that continuum, you can see that in the case of Saatchi, they're already sort of predicting where they think that's all going to go. So another chat question. Is there any new positions created in response to the rise of generative AI within your organization? What are they? And I'm sure at some stage I'll write this all up for an MIT article. Let's take a look. So go to chat, and in chat, you can write down. Now, let me see if I can. I'm frightened about pressing this because I might lose you forever. But let's hear about what you want to say about this in the chat. Okay. Yes, it's working. That's good. Hello. Hi. Everyone's saying hello. Yes. Hi, everyone. Oh, bonjour. Yeah. Oh, it's great. It's very distracting chat, though, isn't it? Thank goodness I'm a female multiprocessor. Soaking wet in Santa Monica. Yeah, you see, you should be in London. It's crisp. Happy birthday. Happy wed. Okay, sorry, I'm still looking at everyone saying hi. Anyone from Japan? No, everyone. No. Oh, nobody. Well, there you are, you see. Saatchi will be interested. Yes, says Daniel. What is it? Oh, yes, you have got some. Okay, so we've got a whole new tech department. We've got AI facilitation. Quite a lot of you are saying no. Non-specific yet, head of AI and emerging technology, no formal title, no new positions yet, no new position. Oh, isn't that interesting? So we really are. We're thinking about it, says Lynn. Yes. We've got it, says Kim. We've got a new CIO organization moving away from shared services. That's interesting, Parveen. Yes, says Takeshi, we have. No, not at the moment. Okay, we've got a Jim saying we've got a head of AI governance. Not really. It's in the hands of data scientists. Get it out of the hands of the data scientists. No, do not let that happen. Okay, this is really interesting. So it sounds as if quite a lot of you haven't. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of chats. There's thousands of people on the webinar today. We will take a look at this later, by the way, because it's just too fascinating, isn't it? But I would say that the primary point that you're saying is just beginning to experiment, but none yet. So we really are at the most exciting cusp of all of this, aren't we? So from about September last year, I've been running webinars and case studies and interviewing people about particularly the human capital domain, because that's an ethical AI. That's interesting, very interesting. And so I've been asking people, well, how are you using this for, how are you using generative AI in the human capital domain? And as you can see, there are 3 sort of slices of where generative AI is working in the people strategy area, which is the area that I come from. Talent development, in terms of obviously very much in recruitment and induction, and indeed in career management. Lots of work now being done with chatbots and generative AI to help you understand yourself. Productivity, I think, is one of the big areas. And we'll have to ask ourselves, how is generative AI really doing something around productivity? Assessment, feedback, skills training, managing collaboration. This is very important. But actually, the area that we're seeing most in terms of knowledge working is what I've called change management, but really it's internal knowledge and external knowledge management. You know, I've been studying companies now for 30 years. And one of the things that we felt really worried about is that we have so much knowledge in our organizations, but we don't know where it is. We don't know how to find it. And it seems to me that this is an area that we're really focusing on in terms of generative AI. Yes, says Marie, absolutely, yes. Yes. So a number of you are agreeing with that. And I've just given you some examples. Now, these are obviously evolving all the time, but you can see, for example, in the law practice, access to law cases, because law has so much knowledge. How do you find all those cases? Alan and Overy are doing some work on that. Morgan Stanley's doing it in terms of the knowledge they've got on wealth management. Duolingo is doing it in terms of personalized feedback. And of course, very much being used in the consulting practices because they employ a lot of knowledge workers. McKinsey are doing a whole on internal knowledge management. BCG are doing content visualization. EY are doing it platforms to look at frauds. So I think, you know, the point is that there's so many very fascinating experiments taking place right now. And so you get back into the chat again. Thank you so much. There are so many chats at the moment. My goodness. What are some examples of using generative AI in the human capital domain within your organization? Get onto your chat and let's hear it. Productivity and efficiency are key, says Veronica. What are you actually doing, Veronica? Because I agree with you, but that's going to be a really important question, isn't it? So what are you doing in terms of reports, languages, scanning candidates, job descriptions, policy writing, lots of people saying employee contracts, skills and talent marketplaces. Very, very interesting. I've been working on freelance talent platforms recently, and they are very fascinating and changing very fast. Reducing the words in reports, getting new experiences, natural language, change management, document creation, recruitment, translations. Oh my goodness, generating KPIs, capturing voice of employees, not number text. Of course, this is the thing, as you say, Amanda, it's all about the text. That's why we skilled knowledge workers have always worked in language and text. And this thing actually deals with language and text. Benchmarking, screening and profiles, mainly job descriptions, says Celia. So look, you know, a lot is happening. And that's why what I talked about earlier, which is how you position yourself, how you think about who's in charge of all this stuff, is going to be really important. So where are we? I want to talk about individuals for a moment. And what I'm going to take you back to is not necessarily generative AI, because frankly, we don't really know enough yet about what it's going to do. I'm going to take you back before that, the technologies that went before. And I want to show you what happens in general when technology impacts work. And what happens in general is that there are winners and there are losers. And let's just ask ourselves, who are the winners? Who are the losers? The winners are people who augment their skills. So they upskill. So for example, they're using, let's say, ChatGPT to do their work. They're getting more productive. They're augmenting. They're actually working closely with it. They're augmenting. They get more productive. They maybe get paid more. Maybe they get higher jobs. I don't know. But somehow it's got a positive impact on their productivity. Or the other winner is somebody who reskills into a completely different job. Because one of the things that we don't know very much about the impact of technology on work, we can say what jobs we think are going to be destroyed by technology, but it's extremely difficult to talk about the jobs that are going to be created. Why? We just don't have the imagination. You know, if I had been up in the north of England when the first vehicle went through a little village in Corby and said to the people looking at that car, what jobs will it create? They could not have imagined the impact on oil companies, rubber companies, the fact that it would impact a huge hotel industry because now people could travel. We just don't have the imagination. So we have the imagination to say what's going to go. We don't have the imagination to say what's going to come. But nevertheless, what you find with reskilling is as those new jobs emerge, the smart people are going to be moving into those new jobs. So who are the losers? Well, the losers are the people who, for whatever reason, personal agency, circumstances, no government support, no corporate support, downskill. So rather than using the technology to augment themselves, the technology actually takes away quite a lot of their job. They downskill into their own job and it's now less paid, or they move out entirely. And they often move into precarious jobs like gig work. That is what's happened across all of the developed world last time around. And I think it's going to be exactly what happens this time around. There will be winners and there'll be losers. And our job as the adults in the room is to ensure that as many people are winners as possible, because we know that in the political situation that we're all in, having people who have lost their jobs, who feel angry, who feel bitter, is not in anybody's interest. So that's why on this webinar today, I'm not talking specifically about the technology itself. I want us to think about what does it mean for people? Are we going to have winners or are we going to have losers? Now, as a psychologist, when I teach and advise companies about things like technology, I often build a persona. One person, and those of you who read one of my books, The 100-Year Life, you'll know that I use personas right the way through. Think about what this means for one person. I've called her Ali. And what's Ali going to be saying now she's seen all of this happening? She'll say, well, I realize I've got to increasingly work with machines. And not just my human colleagues. And I know that I need new skills, but I'm not sure, where to get them. And I see that my role is shifting. So when we do surveys and data on people, these are some of the things that people say about their experiences. And as a psychologist, I can put that into 3 buckets. And this is really where I'd like you to think about your own people. Some of the feelings they've got are emotional. And you can see, for those of you who see it, this is like the sort of grief, what's happened to my job. I actually think ChatGPT is creating more excitement than grief, but there may be grief when people realize just what it means for their jobs. And Guy, you've said this, no interest in reducing headcounts yet. No interest yet, Guy. We're just on our first baby steps here. The cognition is really more about, what does it mean? That's the brain part of you. Will I be able to use it? Am I skilled? How do I need to change? Do I believe it's going to work for me? And then the whole behavioral aspect of how you think about generative AI, which is, I've got to change the way I work. I've got to do things differently. And I wanted to say something about that and actually to stand back for a moment and to know that as you bring in this new technology, the trust that you've established with your employees will be incredibly important. Now, I've talked about that, as you know, for many years. My work, the book I wrote about the pandemic and hybrid work called Redesigning Work, actually showed that managers are crucial to hybrid work, and managers are also going to be crucial to this as well. And employees need to feel that they trust their managers. So this isn't just a piece about technology, it's also a piece about how do you manage change. And as BCG, who've done a very nice experiment, and I'll show you some of the data in a moment, they've said, there are some people they call centaurs who are actually almost like sitting on top of the AI, and there's cyborgs who are interacting with it. And what you're going to see is the most productive people are more to do with the cyborgs. I was advising one of the big creative companies yesterday, and I said, where do you think the new jobs are going to come from? Gosh, that's a great long comment. I can't read it. I really can't, but I will read it later, Mehmet. It looks very fascinating. And they said, we need to work very closely. That the new jobs will all be about prompts. I can't believe that it will, but actually prompting and understanding and actually having it as almost part of your brain. That's where we're going to have to help people think about it. This is a really fascinating piece of work, and I'm sure you've all seen it. If you haven't, this is the work that a whole team of researchers did. It's a Harvard working paper, and they did it with teams at BCG. BCG, as you know, is one of the strategy consulting practices. It employs a lot of knowledge workers. And what they did is they divided them in two groups. They gave them the same task. Half of them could use generative AI technology, the other half couldn't, and they then looked at how well they did it. I mean, it's a wonderful experiment, and you should all be doing this, by the way. This is a proper experimental process. Now, what you see there is two normal distributions. The blue is what would normally happen. So if you ask, let's say 100 people, and I see this with my MBA group, I've got 80 students, and when I look at their reports, I will be ranking them in a normal distribution. The majority are pretty much the same. We've got some really amazing students who are doing incredibly well, and we've got some who are falling behind. Now, what the green and the red tells you about what happens to the group who used generative AI. And as you can see, immediately the quality of the work, it remains a normal distribution. Now that's interesting, but you can see immediately the quality of the work goes up. And one thing that's very important here is that basically what it means is that your medium performers begin to look like high performers. That's very important for productivity, because any productivity that only helps the top performers is not really going to help in general. You need your medium performers to get better. And that's exactly what you're seeing with this piece. And that's why when people are saying productivity increases by 16%, 17%, I see that some of you in the chat are saying even more than that. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about, now, when you go back and say, well, what was actually happening there? Two things come out that are interesting. One is that people were simply working faster. Now, you know this, if you use ChatGPT, it gets very quickly to where you want to be, and you can very easily then work from it. So it moved people faster through the process. It didn't necessarily help them to ask great questions, because that's really where the human comes in. But once you've got a prompt, it gets you to the prompt extremely quickly. So what we're beginning to realize is that the impact that this has on your brain and your ways of working, if you're a knowledge worker, is it basically speeds everything up. It makes it you're faster, and it also broadens it out. So the question that I ask, and I'm sure that many of you here are also going to ask, is, what does it mean to be a human? I'm a psychologist. I'm a humanistic psychologist. Those of you who know my books will know that. So what does it now mean to be a human? And I want to really just stand back and ask that question, because, there are things that generative AI does, and there's things that humans do, and they are different things, contextual knowledge, memory, association, time, outer reach. So, if you think about being a human, generative AI doesn't have a memory, and it can't really look into the future. It doesn't have any notion of what the future is, because it doesn't have data. It's data driven. It has no data about the future. So humans can make an extraordinary, we can add a lot. But the point I want to make, which is sort of, for me, an area that I haven't really got down as much as I would like in terms of writing. But I have a column in the Times of London, and I've been sort of playing around with writing about generative AI now for a few of those columns. And this is one I wrote back in July, called "Humans May Not Have Wings, but They Can Be Creative." So the point, it was just a point that I made is, sitting with my husband one day, drinking coffee, he said, what would happen if humans could fly? And we then had a really funny conversation about that. And I remembered I had memories about going to our house and seeing birds flying and blah, 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 and whatever. It just went on. And it was very funny and amusing and fun. We then went into ChatGPT and said, what happens if humans can fly? And it came up, as you can imagine, with 12, really, this is what happens when humans can fly. You need platforms for this. So ChatGPT had actually broader points than I could make. But here's the point. I had no pleasure doing that task. And that's the thing I really want to say to you, dear listeners, is that's the question we as humans have to address, which is the pleasure of work. Work for us is not a transaction. It's not something you just do for the money. You do it for the sheer pleasure of it. So much of what we do is sheer pleasure. Now, the great outcome of all of this, and I've written another Times article about this, would be that the increase in productivity leads us to spend more time doing pleasurable things. So I'm going to ask you the question about creativity, because it sort of is interesting to me. Do you think that human creativity will be achieved by generative AI between 2022 and 2030? Agree, disagree, don't know. And I'm going to read these marvelous chats while you go on and do it. Yeah. Great chats, by the way. Really fantastic. What an interesting group we are. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let me see if we've got that yet. Let's take a look. Here it is. Yeah, 42% of you agree that actually it is going to make a difference. And I think that's a really important point, because then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it then to be a human, and what is the creative process? And if anyone would like to jump in on LinkedIn, actually, I'm on LinkedIn, and you're thinking about creativity, drop me a note, because I do think that this issue about what is it to be human, what is it to be creative, what's the fun of creativity, what's the pleasure of work, I think that this is going to be at the crux of what happens next. Okay, so let's move forward. We're moving towards the end of this. So we've looked at that. And I just wanted very briefly to talk about the approach that I take, and then we're going to open up for questions. So my consulting practice, HSM, we think that really, there's 4 things you need to be thinking about right now. One is, are you asking the right questions, about how you're using it? Is there a narrative? Because what we noticed when we looked at technology and the implementation of technology is that it was a lot about what you want to say about it, how it comes across emotionally to people. What experiments are you running? That very much like the that experimental situation we looked at the beginning, and where are the productivity boosts going to come from, and what is it you're going to say? So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for these amazing chats. I'm going to look, Elizabeth, isn't that incredible?
Yeah, fantastic. Really engaged. This has been great. I've also been reading all of the people loving what you're doing here today.
Well, I haven't seen
fantastic.
That yet. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Elizabeth.
And lots of people very happy to be here. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got a ton of questions, but I just wanted to start off with one of my own for you, which is that, given that you've been, going around and gathering information, getting insight, because this is a experiment happening in real time around us. Yeah. What surprised you or interested you the most in what you saw coming back from our audience today and what they had to say?
I can't really tell, to be honest, Elizabeth. I honestly haven't been multi-processing, because I've been doing a presentation, Elizabeth. Come on.
I know. Yeah, well, I guess the poll results, was there anything in those poll results that seemed?
I've sort of been glancing, but I haven't really been processing.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to process. I think just glancing, Elizabeth, and you've probably got a better idea than I have. I think, that the most surprising thing about generative AI, of course, is the thing itself, isn't it? I mean, it's just astonishing. And I wrote, the reason I'm writing about this in my Times article is that you've got to write about it and have it published the next day, don't you, Elizabeth? Or otherwise, I mean, I'm not going to write a book about generative AI because in a year when it gets published, everyone will be going, oh, for goodness sake, Lynda, I can't believe you've said that. So, you know, we've just got to be watching. You remember, these are all my diaries. These are my pandemic diaries. I'm doing the same. This is my generative AI diary.
Right.
You just have to write, you know, for me as a psychologist, the issue is about the nature of work, you know, which is to say, why do we work and what do we get out of it? And I think if we lose sight of that question, then we just become entirely transactional and entirely saying, you know, okay, we're going to be more productive. Well, so what, really? So that's really, for me, the big takeaway. But thank you to everyone for these comments. They look amazing. And I certainly am going to spend the rest of the afternoon. And then we'll write our next column on it, won't we, Elizabeth? Let's make that as a promise.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And now I'm afraid I'll say to the audience, you know, Lynda has made clear she's a human capital expert and not here to offer expert opinions on the technology backgrounds of Gen AI. So I'm going to put aside a lot of questions. People really want to know where the tech is going. But some really good questions for you related to how we fit it into the organization. A couple came in about especially around that head of AI role.
Yeah.
Do you see, or what are you, is that being seen as more of a somebody coming from the business side or coming from the tech side?
Well, actually, that's a really good question. And I don't think we know enough about it. I mean, quite a number of you said that a few of you said you had generative AI. If you could put into the chat now where they came from, the business or the tech. In the case of Saatchi, they came from the business. They were actually head of strategy. They weren't head of tech. So I think, you can see why it comes out of strategy, because you want somebody who's got an experimental mindset, who sees this as a learning opportunity and sees it as an organizational structuring issue. I mean, Elizabeth, you know very well, because it's been a big part of the MIT story, MIT Sloan story, is how organizations are structuring themselves. And, you have authors and I've written about this huge push for decentralization. But of course, when you push for decentralization, you have a lot of replication of knowledge. So I think what, you want somebody with a knowledge mindset, with a learning mindset. That could be a technology person. It could be a business person. But for me, I think that the innovation, and thanks actually, Ren, you make the point there, the innovation part of it is what's really crucial.
Right. Okay. And another interesting question I thought about, as we're talking about upskilling the workforce, this was a question, we've had a few worded a little bit differently that have come in. We're thinking about teaching, the new skill to, prompt engineering, for example. What about doubling down on critical thinking? And on critical thinking, like how will, if we're going to, the questions are sort of asking, if we're going to have all of this input that needs to be really carefully examined, how will we, how could we, sort of push that agenda and really help people sort of be intentional and develop those critical thinking capabilities?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually. And, there's two sort of points that you've made, Elizabeth. One is about training people in how to use technology and how to upskill and in some cases reskill. And what we know, if you look at the last big wave of technology change in organizations was the call centers. Do you remember when people went into call centers? They had to really change the way that they worked. And, the companies who did that best put a big emphasis on training people. So the training people to do this, to use it as best they can, is going to be a big part of the agenda. But I think you're right that you also have to double down on human skills. And I haven't shown that in today's presentation, but the work that we did at the World Economic Forum, where we looked at what is it that what's human. You won't be surprised that it's got words like judgment. That's really important. I mean, making judgments is very important, because machines will do that for you, but you don't know the ethics of that judgment. And a number of you have asked questions about, diversity and inclusion. Well, as you know, some of the stuff that comes out of a machine is certainly not inclusive. So Renee, I think you're right. I agree with you. Human judgment is going to be incredibly important. So you get those sort of cognitive stuff like judgment and decision making, and then you get the soft human stuff like empathy and listening. And for me, if I look at the great leaders at the moment, what they seem to be, well, not all of them, but some of them are empathic, and they're good at listening, and they're good at, sort of helping people become the best that they can. Well, certainly good managers are like that. So I think that combination of human judgment and decision-making skills, plus the human's capacity to empathize, to understand, to care for, Elizabeth, you and I have, Elizabeth, by the way, is is a wonderful person from MIT. So I just want to shout out for that. But I've written quite a bit for MIT on friendship and how important friendship is at work. The reason you go to work is because you have a friend at work. So we have to sort of understand that this new technology is going to give us a fantastic opportunity to be more productive, to find things more quickly. But it doesn't take away from the fact that we humans love to be with other people. We care about other people. That's what it is. But critical thinking, Stephen, you're right. I mean, that whole cognitive critical thinking, decision making, judgment, that is really, really crucial.
And I think a flip side of that is a few other questions coming in. There are real concerns about skills stagnating, or people losing some of their ability. Say even just the writing muscle. Just a certain amount of, just as they say, we've lost some chunks of our brain that navigate, because we all rely on GPS now.
Yeah. Well,
how do we guard against that?
Yeah, I think that's the problem, honestly, as a professor I face with my MBA students, which is to say, if you immediately go straight to ChatGPT, what is it that you're giving up? What is it so that's why the Times article I wrote, it's just such a silly thing, really. What would happen if humans could fly? Well, that actually gave me an opportunity to be funny. I told a funny little joke about what happens when humans can fly. I'm sure you've got lots of jokes out there about what happens when humans fly. It was poignant. I had a memory of it. I then said, maybe I should be thinking more. I was actually using the whole human brain. And I agree with you that and it's the same with any technology, is that if it replaces rather than augments, then humans become less of who they are. We become less of what the enormous human potential. And a few of the technology writers are now saying, look, it is just a machine, it just is a very clever machine that we're all very excited about, but there's nothing in the universe we've discovered that's like the human brain. So let's try and do the very best we can with that in terms of creativity, humor, empathy, all the other things that make it worth living.
Right. And then let's see, we have time for at least another one, and maybe two. Another question we've gotten in various versions, but who do you think needs to be at the table in an organization in setting policy around the use of, especially a tool like Gen AI, which, as we've seen, is one that just is finding its way in. As with other things, not necessarily IT approved. There's no gatekeeping. So who should be part of that conversation? Those conversations.
Well, I think if you think about the organization, I think each group sort of has a role to play. The first is the CEO and the leadership team have got to set a narrative. And I think this is generally true, Elizabeth. When you have high levels of ambiguity, the job of a leader is to tell stories about the future, to help people think, this is where we're walking, that this is why it's happening, this is how we feel about that. So that's really the leader's role. I think managers play a hugely important role, just as they did during the pandemic, in terms of helping people understand what's going to happen to them, helping them upskill and reskill. But in terms of organizational change, I'm a big fan of getting everybody involved. And the work that we do with HSM sometimes brings up to 500,000 people together on a platform, using their own language, talking about things. So if I was a CEO right now, I would want to run a jam which involves 100,000 people in my company saying, how are we going to use this? What are we going to think about it? How should we use it? What are the problems? What are the opportunities? Because I think one of the great things about technology now is it's joining everybody up. You can ask everybody, what are you thinking about this? And that's what I would be doing. I wouldn't use surveys, by the way. I would actually ask them in a jam where they can actually write down. You see, these comments are so much more interesting in terms of simply saying, 1 to 5. So use language as a way of exploring some of these issues. And I would get, and this idea of, generations. I mean, Elizabeth, I hate, as all psychologists do, generational labels, Gen X, Gen Y, baby boomers. I despise it. It's a very horrible stereotyping. And so we shouldn't stereotype the idea that it's only young people who are thinking about this. That's not the case at all. In fact, if you look at people at every stage in their working life, they are very interested. And there's even some data that show the over 50s are really working to experiment and to understand generative AI. So I would say don't be blinkered about what you expect your employees to do.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And let's see, maybe we've got about a minute. So just for a quick one, I think as you were talking about some of the ways of using Gen AI, especially with regard to human capital, you had mentioned well-being, and people popped up in the chat saying, how so? So maybe if you can give us a quick answer to that one as a final note.
Well, I think, the problem with well-being that we've all got is that we have too much data and we're not processing it, and we lose our focus. So for me, where technology and well-being can really work together is to let you give focus, but also maybe, to help you understand yourself better. There are apps, well-being apps that are talking to you about yourself. That we're still in research about how good those are, by the way. But I think that the question of employee well-being is a very important one. And generative AI has both a positive role to play, but also a potentially negative, because it becomes an enormous distraction. And that we know is one of the major downsides of how we use technology. We become too distracted by it, as we are with social media.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you. Well, this has been terrific. Really, really a great time. And I know that we'll be we'll be sending out follow-ups to you. We'll be sharing a lot of this data with you. So I think you'll be able to draw on more of it. So really appreciate what a great audience we've had and how they jumped in and answered the call. Really.
It's a shame we couldn't get everybody's face up, wasn't it? It was just great. So much. And thanks so much, MIT, for doing this, by the way. I mean, it's just been absolutely fabulous. And this is exactly what we need to have to learn.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Lynda, for sharing your insights, and thanks to our sponsor, Randstad, as well. And I want to let attendees know that a recording of the program will be available in about 3 or 4 days, and we'll be sending you a link to that, as well as a PDF of the slide presentation. And so thank you for being here with us today, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.